In last lecture, we have discussed about the comparative cost advantage theory of international trade introduced by David Ricardo. In this lecture, we will discuss about the Heckscher-Ohlin theory of international trade. It is known as factor endowment theory of international trade and also modern theory of factor endowment. Bertin Ohlin, in his famous book Interregional and International Trade, criticized classical theory of international trade and formulated the general equilibrium or factor proportion theory of international trade. It is also known as the modern theory of international trade or Heckscher-Ohlin theory of international trade. In fact, Heckscher, a teacher of Ohlin, who first propounded the idea in 1919 that trade results from differences in factor endowments in different countries, and Ohlin carried it forward to build the modern theory of international trade. He has successfully extended this theory applicable to single market to deal with trade between different regions within a country or between different countries. According to Ohlin, the immediate cause of international trade always is some commodities can be brought more cheaply from other regions, whereas in the same region their production is possible at high prices because of relative factor endowments and factor prices. The statement of factor endowment theory is countries that are rich in capital will export capital intensive goods and countries that have much labor will export labor intensive theories. This theory is based on assumptions which are produced here. Number one is there is 2 by 2 by 2 model. It means there are two countries in international trade, two goods and factors of production are two in production process of goods. Second is each region possesses a paper currency system, and this paper currency system is insulted from external financial influences. There is perfect competition in commodity as well as factor markets. Next is there is full employment of resources which are using for the production of both commodities in both countries. Next is there are quantitative differences in factor endowments in different regions, but qualitatively they are homogeneous. It means in some countries one factor is abundantly available and in other countries different factor of production is heavily available, but quality of both the factors of production is same in all the countries. Next is the production functions of the two commodities have different factor intensities. Means out of two commodities one is produced by capital intensive techniques and second labor intensive techniques. Next is the production function are different for different commodities but are the same for each commodity in both countries. It means whatever is the production function, it may be constant returns to scale, it may be increasing returns to scale or decreasing returns to scale. It is common in both the countries, but it is different for different commodities. Means two countries are producing some electronics goods like radio in India and China. production techniques are same in India to produce radio in India and China. But production techniques for different commodity is different than production of radio. It means production functions are different for different commodities. Next is factor intensities are non-reversible. Means there is no change in the techniques of production. There is perfect mobility of factors within each region, but immobile internationally. It means factors of production are mobile within a country, but immobile between the countries. There is no transport cost is also taken one of the important assumption in this theory. Next is there is free and unrestricted trade between the two countries. Means whatever they are producing in our country, they can export to other countries freely. There are no restrictions like quotas, excise duties, like these trade barriers. Next is there is constant returns to scale in production of each commodity in each region. Means whatever you want produce any commodity, returns to scale is constant. Next is tastes and preferences of consumers and their demand patterns are same in both regions. Next is there are no restrictions on the movement of goods between the two regions. Next is there is no change in technological knowledge. It means technological knowledge is constant while applying this theory. There is incomplete specialization in production of both the commodities in country. It means there is no specialization in production of any one commodity in both the countries. This theory we can explain by the graph. Before this, we can explain this theory by a simple example. According to the Heckscher-Ohlin, immediate cause of international trade is the difference in relative commodity prices caused by differences in relative demand and supply of factors as a result of differences in factor endowments between the two commodities. Fundamentally, the relative scarcity of factors in relation to demand is essential for trade between two regions. Commodities which uses large quantity of scarce factors are imported because their prices are high, while those using abundant factors are exported because their prices are low. The Heckscher-Ohlin theory is explained in terms of two definitions. Number one, factor abundance in terms of factor price and in terms of physical quantities. Here I have explained Heckscher-Ohlin theory with factor abundance in terms of factor price. According to the Heckscher-Ohlin definition, country A is abundant in capital if prices of capital to prices of labor is less than prices of capital to prices of labor in country B. If capital is relatively cheap in country A, the country is abundant in capital, and if labor is relatively cheap in country B, the country B is abundant in labor. Thus, country A will produce and export the capital intensive goods and import labor intensive commodity. On the other hand, country B will produce and export labor intensive goods and import the capital intensive commodity. And this can illustrated by the graph put here. Suppose there are two countries, Britain and China. They are producing wheat and cloth. Cloth is producing by capital intensive techniques, whereas wheat by labor intensive technique. In the above diagram, OX axis shows wheat, which is labor intensive commodity, and OY axis shows cotton, which is capital intensive commodity. XX is the isocount of cloth and YY is of wheat. They are the same for both the countries, Britain and China. The line BB1 represents relative factor price in country Britain for both commodities. Assuming that each isocount represents one unit of respective commodity, then first unit of cloth will produce with ON amount of capital and OM amount of labor at point E, where the isocost line BB1 is tangent to the isocount axis. Similarly, isocount curve YY tangent to BB1 at point E1, and 1 unit of wheat will be produced within ON1 amount of capital and OM1 amount of labor. Since capital is abundant and cheap in Britain, it will specialize in the production of capital intensive commodity, cloth, and export the relatively capital abundant and cheap commodity to China. The line CC1 represents relative factor price in country China for both commodities. Assuming that each isocount represents one unit of respective commodity, then first unit of cloth will produce with ON2 amount of capital and OM2 amount of labor at point E2, where the price line CC1 is tending to the isocount XX. Similarly, a similar factor price line C2, C3 is to be drawn parallel to CC1. Isocount curve YY tangent to CC3 price line at point E3, and 1 unit of wheat will be produced with ON3 amount of capital and OM3 amount of labor. Since labor is abundant and cheap in China, it will specialize in production of labor intensive commodity wheat and export the relatively labor abundant and cheap commodity to the Britain. This theory can also explain in terms of factor abundance in physical terms. However, this theory is also criticized by different economists, in which first criticism is 2 by 2 by 2 model. Olin has been criticized for presenting 2 by 2 by 2 model based on oversimplified assumptions. But as Olin himself pointed out, it can be extended to many regions, many commodities, and many factors. He demonstrated it in the mathematical appendix to his book. This theory is criticized as a statistics theory. The Olin's model is statistic in nature. It only gives some characteristics of an economy at a given point of time. Next criticism is factors are not homogeneous in both the countries. The theory assumes the existence of the homogeneous factors in the two countries which can be measured for calculating factor endowment ratios. But in reality, no two factors are homogeneous qualitatively between the countries, and even one factor is of various types. Next criticism is production techniques not homogeneous. Olin model assumes homogeneous production techniques for each commodity in the two countries. But production techniques are different for the same commodity in the two countries. Tastes and demand patterns are not identical. The Hechter-Olin theory is based on the assumption of identical tastes and demand patterns of consumption in both countries. This assumption implies that the taste and demand patterns of consumers are same for different income groups. This is unrealistic. Moreover, with inventions taking place in consumers' goods, changes in taste and demand patterns of consumers also occur even among developed countries. Next point is no constant returns. The assumption that there are constant returns to scale is also not realistic because a country having rich factor endowments often obtains the advantages of economies of scale through lesser production and exports. Next point is transport cost influence trade. This theory does not consider transport costs in trade between the two countries. However, along with transport costs, loading and uploading of goods and other port charges affect the prices of produced commodities in the two countries. When transport costs are included, they lead to price differentials for the same commodity in the two countries, which affect their trade relations. Next point is full employment and perfect competition. The Heckscher-Ohlin theory is based on the unrealistic assumptions of full employment and perfect competition because there is neither full employment nor perfect competition in any country of the world. Rather, countries do not have free trade but impose trade restrictions on the large scale. Leontief paradox has falsified the theory. Ohlin assumes that relative factor prices reflect exactly relative factor endowments. It implies that in the determination of factor prices, supply is more important than demand. However, the demand factors are given more importance in determining factor prices. A capital rich country will export a labor intensive commodity because the high demand for capital will raise the price of capital relative to labor. Next point is partial equilibrium analysis. According to the Haberler-Ohlin's theory, by and large is partial equilibrium analysis. And last is factor prices do not determine commodity prices. According to Weisenholz, the prices of commodities are determined by their utility to the consumers and that the prices of raw materials and labor are ultimately dependent on the prices of the final commodities. He said that the right approach is to start with commodity prices rather than factor prices. In short, despite these assumptions criticized by different economists, the Ohlin theory of international trade is definitely an improvement over the classical theory as it attempts to explain the basis of international trade in the general equilibrium setting. According to Lancaster, the Ohlin model occupies the very center of international trade theory for reasons unconnected with its realism, and indeed strengthened by the very properties which have been subject to so much criticism. Thank you. Thank you very much.